the first thing I'd say is those of us in Canada don't have nearly as much fun as our Brazilian friends when fighting asbestos. We seem to sit in parliaments and meeting rooms and very seriously, but not with enough theater. My name is Nathan-Cullen. I'm a member of Parliament from British Columbia. I am in fact here on behalf of Pat Martin, who some of you know, who's been a long-standing champion, long before it was popular in Canada, to take up the cause of victims from this deadly product, and is a good friend of mine. We sit across the aisle from each other, but in the same party, and I have great respect for Pat's work. First of all, thank you very much for the chance to speak. Secondly, the last time I was in Chicago, I was a very young and naive man who decided to run a marathon on a whim, and came in from Toronto on the bus. And so if I leave Chicago this time not having passed out or fallen down or ruined my legs for a year, I will consider this trip a successful one as compared to my first time in Chicago. It's a joy to be back in the city, particularly on this topic. I think when I think about this issue and the work that we've been trying to do, and I'm obviously speaking to the converted, there's a fellow, probably one of America's greatest gifts to Canada, a fellow by the name of Thomas King. He's an author, First Nations person who's since become Canadian, and he says that the truth about stories is that we are all stories. And by that he means that we all here today and in our lives have stories about ourselves, about our families, about our communities that we repeat and reinforce every day, and from time to time change. We in Canada have a story about ourselves, was mentioned earlier in the introduction. We will fiercely defend our reputation as the most polite people on the planet. We will say, excuse me and pardon me and sorry before anybody else in the room has a chance to. We like to be liked. We like to be seen as folks on the world stage who wish to do no harm. There are a couple of glaring exceptions to this story, and unfortunately this is one of them. I am happy, I should say, that I do not bring greetings on behalf of the Canadian government. I do not represent the Canadian government, particularly on this issue. For while I'm a fierce and proud Canadian, the hypocrisy of the Canadian government successively, one after another, when it comes to defending and supporting the Chrysotile Asbestos Institute, is one that most Canadians don't respect and adhere to, but yet it goes on. Just this week, I live in northwestern British Columbia. So it's like, if you have to imagine it and you haven't been up in that part of the woods, it's like Alaska, but without the Sarah Palin. We, yeah, we celebrate it every day. When I've had as the member of Parliament just adjacent to Alaska, nestled up in the border there, when I saw McCain's choice and knowing Ms. Palin and some of the decisions that she's made, I really thought that a moat might be appropriate to dig across the Canadian-U.S. border if she was successful. Thank you, Chicago, for producing Mr. Obama instead. The riding, the constituency I represent, is 35% First Nations. It is 300,000 square kilometers, a little bit bigger than the country of Poland. And we have an expression up there where we say the land makes the people don't make the land. We are informed and made by the place that we come from. The First Nations have had a particular impact on me and my philosophies and the ways that I go about trying to do my job in terms of representation, and it comes from a very basic belief that those that go out on our behalfs in elected office, representational government, ought to speak with the best intentions, the greatest purpose of the people we represent, with the greatest dignity that we can muster. This is not the case when it comes to Canada's representation of the asbestos industry. Just this week in my little town in northern BC, my wife and I worked with my father and father-in-law on a home renovation. We're expecting twins in a couple months, and our house is not quite capable of handling twins right now. And my father-in-law works in worker safety in British Columbia. He got into worker safety because his father fell off a scaffolding at a construction site when my father-in-law was just 10 years old. And the following year, my father-in-law had to go out and work to support the family where they lived. And as we were doing our work around my house, which has chrysotile in the roof because it was built in the 50s, so we can't go there, I made some comment about rules and regulations and how unpopular he was and his ministry trying to enforce these rules on industry. And he said, well, a lot of these rules are written in blood. And my father-in-law is a very understated man. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, we didn't invent these things from nowhere. A lot of the rules we have to protect workers are the result of people dying and being seriously injured. They are written in blood, and we must defend them. Because if we take them away, if we don't create them in the first place, more people will die. And I thought about that on my flight down here, about the rules that are not being drawn up. Let me tell you about my bill, because I can't take any credit for it. It is to ban asbestos in all its forms and the full exportation ban of asbestos from Canada. It was, it struck me that no one had come up with it before, which I thought was a little strange. But I run a contest every year in my riding where I go around to all the high schools and I ask the kids to write a bill on anything that they want, any idea that they have, to improve Canada, to improve our country, improve the future. And we call it Create Your Canada, and it's really exciting. And so all these kids write these bills on all kinds of things, very inventive, and I got this committee and they pick, and then I fly the winners to our capital in Ottawa, and I take two bills, the two winning bills, and I write them into a piece of proper legislation. I work with the clerks in the parliament, and we put them up, and I present them on these young people's behalf as they sit in the gallery and watch. Last year's winners, 3 girls from my little town, had done some research and had a presentation by a woman named Kathleen Ruff, who some of you know, who's a fierce hurricane of a woman, and you don't want to stand between that person and any objective that she has. When my party, the New Democrats, announced that we were going to move on our position on asbestos and support the full ban of export, my announcement to my colleagues that sit with me was that you will be getting no more calls and emails from Kathleen Ruff. And there was about 24 people around the table that said, thank God. One person can make such a difference. Because she presented to this high school class about asbestos. These girls did some research, drew up a bill, won the contest, came to Ottawa, and then shifted another 125 members of Parliament in the House of Commons over to the right side. Because the voices of 3 young people speaking directly, earnestly, with passion is a very hard thing to resist for a politician. It's a very hard thing for people who wish to represent their constituents to stand in the way of. 710,000 tons were exported from Canada in 1988. We're now down to, as you saw in the graph, 170,000 tons, almost 70% drop off. $77 million industry, give or take. I think that number's a lie, but let's take it for what it is. $77 million. We sent out $2.5 billion in wheat last year. This is a very, very small industry. Less than 600 workers that we can properly account for. I just had a pulp mill close in my riding 3 weeks ago with 550 workers gone. The politic in Canada, and I want to get to this because it's important for folks to understand that are not from our part of the world. Quebec is one of our provinces. It's got an unusual political history from time to time. Every 25 years or so, they try to break away from Canada, and then they decide not to, and then we all welcome them back in, and we wait for another generation to try to break away again, and the world scratches its head as to why. Quebec is politically very sensitive and important for every political party. They have 25% of the seats in our parliament, and our parliament is where all the power is. We also have a Senate, but forget it. It gets appointed and it doesn't matter and nothing happens there. Everything happens in the House of Commons side, the congressional side, if you will. My leader of my party, Jack Layton, and our deputy from Quebec, when we decided to flip our position and go to the right side, went into the town of Thetford Mines, where these workers are, because the unions for too long had disgracefully defended the rights of those, the so-called rights of those workers to maintain those jobs. And when we maintained that position and went in, we said we have to go talk to these workers about a fair and just transition out of this industry that's killing them and killing other people. And for 2 days, my leader and my deputy from Quebec got their heads taken off, but left with respect and left alive to fight another day. In the next election, that person from Quebec won his seat, and we continued on, and the sky didn't crash in on us. It is the position of the federal government of Canada right now, the Conservative government, led by our Prime Minister Harper, that the defense of the asbestos industry is the #1 priority for Quebec. #1. And they are the party to be trusted to do that defense. We lost in November in 2006, just to pull off 1 month, the number of jobs we lost in that 1 month alone is represented by 1% of what we lost in that month would be the loss of the asbestos jobs in Quebec. So 1% of total job losses in November of 2006 in Canada would have been the total loss if we shut down the asbestos industry tomorrow. The asbestos lobby has received more than $20 million from the Canadian government since 1984. And let me speak to the challenge that I see and the opportunity, and I'll end on this. I believe there's a tipping point in front of us in Canada. Very conservative groups like the Canadian Cancer Foundation and others have come forward and finally put a definitive position down, saying that export and development of any asbestos in Canada must stop. The challenge is this: people are incredulous in Canada that this still goes on. When I stand up in front of groups of very nice, polite, pardon me, Canadians and say, not only do we allow asbestos to be exported while we're spending tens of millions of dollars ripping it out of our schools and hospitals and parliament buildings, somewhat ironically, we give them money to do it. We lobby other countries to take our asbestos and slap a little warning label on the side to, oh, by the way, when you're sitting in the backwoods of India, you should throw on full respirator gear and make sure that you do everything properly. Canadians don't believe it. It's so far from any normal circumstance that it's unusually difficult to rile people up around it, because it seems like I must be stretching the truth. We must be lying. There goes the politician exaggerating again. The toxicity awareness is growing, and this is where the opportunity lies. We're coming to a point, and a tipping point in Canada, where the crisis, and in that crisis is the opportunity for change, where people are starting to become aware of what's in our water, what's in our walls and carpets and food. And that awareness, that public education that is being done around the world and in Canada as well, is the place that we need to come to as a country to finally put this thing over the top. To finally have that bill that was presented by me, but on behalf of the young people of my riding, and I'd suggest many young people across the country, that the hypocrisy must end. That we as a country can do better, be better, and not hide our heads in shame when it comes to the issue of asbestos for some cheap, crass politic. And when I think of where I come from and the First Nations leadership that I work with that try to represent themselves with dignity, with the respect of time of 7 generations behind, 7 generations forward, this is a clear decision. This is a clear choice. And the time will come. We'll win. We'll win this. But the only question is how many more people have to die and suffer because of our hypocrisy.